So good morning again, like every other class. Any queries, questions, comments? Yes, please.
I have a query, for example, textbook. Reading textbook.
Okay.
Um,
Would you like to come here and use the mic?
in Bangladesh for the last 15 years, what we have seen, like when Bangladesh doesn't produce the textbook, right? And this has the free to everyone up to class 10. My question is like, since government produced textbook, and what we have seen like last 15 years, Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, he used some political ideology. For example, he emphasized further and the other nations and some other things. So my question is like, producing textbook, does it, ideologically is it moral or immoral, like to explain political or non-political ideology?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I think I told you the story of Tilak getting arrested. You remember? So this great nationalist who is a revered figure in India, in the Indian national movement, Indian nationalist movement. So he gets arrested primarily because of a book, of a story in the textbook. So I can't answer the question whether it is moral or immoral, because that creates a binary that's very difficult to answer. But what I can say is that, and there is a lot of studies on this, that, so the example that I gave you yesterday, for example, The Citizen of India is an ideological book. It is definitely an ideological book. It wanted to make citizens, British citizens or Indian citizens of the British Empire of a certain type. So if you read that book, it will give you an idea of how ideology operates. The first chapter of the book is the geography of India. Okay? And it tells you very interesting stories. For example, it says that certain regions of India, which are mostly tribal regions, are should not be considered as the mainstream of India, because they speak different languages, they eat differently, they live differently, etc., etc. So through the book, the idea of a mainstream Indian citizen is getting constructed, which is of course ideological. Whether textbooks are ideological in nature, they always are. So there is no neutral textbook. The very fact that you are using a certain principle or an approach to create a textbook means that you believe in a certain philosophy and therefore a certain ideology. Okay? There can be no textbook without a principle or an approach. For example, if I say that I am using a communicative language teaching principle to create a textbook, it is a principle, it is a philosophy that I believe in. And all philosophies have ideological in a very general sense, so not only in the sense that it has come to mean itself since the 18th and the 19th century. Remember, the word ideological actually refers to an ensemble of ideas. Okay, so if certain ideas which are supposed to be coherent are put together, that's an ideology. Ideology, the current definition of ideology, which is primarily through the Marxist interpretation of ideology, has a slightly separate, different understanding of ideology. Okay? Because Marxism, for example, believes that ideology is a construction, okay, which is hidden. So if you can see ideology, it's not an ideology. Yeah? It is a hidden phenomenon. But that is not how ideology is understood. So if you take ideologies in a very broader sense, that is it a collection of ideas, a coherent collection of ideas, then all textbooks are ideological. So I hope that answers the question. The third question, which is implicit in the two questions that you asked, is should state produce textbooks? Now that's a difficult one to answer actually, because I don't know. Of course. Yeah. So, yeah. Now, remember, across the world, the state does play a role, okay, in forming what we call textbooks, any kind of a textbook. It might be a very direct role in some countries. It might be a very indirect role in certain countries. Okay? So there is this educational, well, he's a philosopher, but he has done a lot of work on education. I'll just, sir would know. You should read him, where he talks about the different forms of what he calls habitus in education. Okay? His name is So if you have looked at Bourdieu's work, then you would know that he talks constantly about this, and he expands the idea of education. So the very fact that you are learning something is always ideological. There is no escape from that. You are already within the habitus of education. Yeah? Now, whether it leads you, now that habitus will take you to different pathways depending on different factors. For example, he talks about social capital, cultural capital, etc. So what kind of social capital do you have? What kind of cultural capital do you have? That will also determine the pathways that you take. Okay, but that is what, so to answer the question whether the state should get involved depends on any kind of an education for Bourdieu, whether it is state involved, non-state involved, is ideological in nature. Because you, as students, we carry different sorts of capitals within it. Okay. Sir and I were discussing, for example, if you really can't talk about education in India, for example, without talking about caste. Okay. So that's a different kind of a social capital that you carry into the classroom, the caste that you belong to, etc. Because that's a major social factor in India, and you really can't deny it. You really can't say, no, okay, we are simply going to unsee caste and talk about a generalized education, etc. And I'm sure every country will have similar kinds of distinctions. Thank you. Interesting comments.
I think it's a common phenomena influencing curriculum because he told that, but now when the curriculum changed and now the textbook here, the recent incident also included, it is also biased, sir.
The July movement also repeat on the textbook. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
The government changes and the textbook changes and
Yeah.
the teacher also changes. So
Now, I'll qualify the word biased because I think, in a sense, every textbook is biased, right? Because it always carries a certain kind of a principle within it. For example, I wish we had more time. So there is a certain kind of analysis in linguistics. I'm not going to talk about it today. It's called transitivity analysis, okay? Using grammatical forms. So very interesting studies have come out from this. So people have looked at textbooks, for example, in the representation of gender by using transitivity analysis. Just write this word, if you're interested, you can look it up. So some studies, for example, it's very common in the textbook in the 80s and the 90s, especially within the global south, partly also in the global north. So you will have stories, right? And in all these stories, you will see the verbs that are known as active verbs are associated with men, and verbs that are known as passive verbs, okay, so women will be sitting or reading or will be within domestic spaces. Men will be outside doing activities, etc. So these kind of verbal demarcation is biased in a certain sense. Okay? So whether textbooks are biased or not, they are always biased. Depends on how much of bias actually shows. So it is the degree of bias, how much of bias actually shows. Okay? If it is extremely biased, then, well, it's not a textbook, it's propaganda. Yeah? So you'll have to make a distinction between a textbook and propaganda. Yeah. Any other comments? Yes, yes. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll come back to you. We'll start with, yeah.
No,
Sivari.
I was just thinking that when we acquire a language, let's say, there is necessarily a situation of dialogue between this language which has been acquired and the previous language
Yeah.
which is already there.
Yeah.
So can we somehow kind of even unconsciously we form a kind of synonymous relationship that this is synonymous to that.
I'll take that over the paper. Okay. Sorry, yeah. It's a technical procedure. No, go ahead, please.
So we form this synonymous this thing. Now when there is this idea of untranslatability,
Yeah.
should we not kind of emphasize that in even language teaching, where for example, let's say the normal idea of dharma and religion. Now, obviously they are not similar because yesterday I was reading a book and it's again and again emphasizing religion and dharma, which is 1956, so it's obviously we cannot help it. But now when we know it, that there are untranslatable situations in every language, so should we not address it from the get-go, like from the very basic level?
So the question that you're asking is primarily a very fundamental question, which is when you have more than two languages in your head, okay? I think the first part of the question is whether these two kind of interact with each other.
Yeah, is there a dialogue?
Yeah. And the second part of the question is in the question of untranslatability of language or bad translatability of language. How do we address it through language teaching? So let me come to the first part of the question. If you look at the global south in general, okay, I'm using this political term global south, but we know that there are problems with this term because the global south itself is extremely varied. It's very different types of global souths that they are. But let me use it for the sake of indicating the countries that I mean. So if you look at this part of the world, then bilinguality and multilinguality is generally the norm, yeah, rather than an exception. People would know more than one language in general. Yeah. And if you look, again, I mean, it's a very bad generalization, I am aware of that, but let me state this, in the global north, this is exactly the opposite. In the global north, monolinguality is the norm, bilinguality is something that you add on to it. Okay? This again might not be true because we know that there are huge amounts of variations over there as well. But for the sake of simplicity, let's accept this argument. And if you proceed from this, then there has been a lot of research that has happened, for example, in second language acquisition, about how, for example, bilinguals and multilinguals pick up languages. Because as I told you, if you remember in one of the classes, that by the time an Indian or a Sri Lankan or a Bangladeshi student comes to a formal classroom to learn English, the child would definitely have more than one language in the head already, okay, before coming to learn English. So these kind of children, of course, would learn English in a different way because they already have these things. So there is a lot of research that is happening now that how these languages, how do these languages process themselves or interact with each other, etc. Initial research, the book that you are mentioning, 1956, this is exactly the period when initial research began with this, and therefore the direct method became so important. The direct method assumes its significance primarily because it was assumed that your home language, it was called mother tongue, influences and therefore hinders your learning of English. This was primarily in America. I think I told you the story. So a large number of Spanish-speaking people who were coming to the south of America were going to classrooms, these community classrooms where they were going to learn English, and the belief was that since they were using Spanish at home, or they were using Spanish in most of their daily interactions, they were not learning English because there was something called mother tongue interference. It was a phenomenon. Okay? It was called MTI, mother tongue interference. or L2 interference as it was called, L1 interference. And therefore, L1 has to be removed in order to understand the second language, which is not true at this point of time. So, there is a lot of neurolinguistic research, for example, to understand how, and it shows very clearly that if you have multiple languages in the head, it does not mean that it confuses you. You know the domains in which these languages operate, and you know very clearly what to use in which domain. Okay? So, the brain kind of, and sometimes you also know how to mix languages, and therefore, you will see that large number of multilingual speakers mix languages. Okay? And they would mix it not ungrammatically, they would know exactly which element to insert in a sentence at which point of time, absolutely grammatically. Okay? So, obviously, so sometimes, so it is very difficult to understand the human brain, but so sometimes I wonder if Chomsky in a sense was right, okay, where he said that there is something called universal grammar. So, all languages have a universal grammar, and depending on the specificity of the language, the universal grammar gets triggered in different ways. Okay, he calls it cusp. Anyway, so that I hope kind of addresses the first part of the question, which is, do they interact? Yes, they do. How do they interact? We don't still know. Okay. The second part of the question is something that I have forgotten now, which was the untranslatability question. The untranslatability question, see, if you have, are you doing translation studies in world literature? Little bit, okay. Okay. Now, the question of untranslatability has been addressed in different ways. Okay. Depends on what we are calling untranslatable. Okay. So, if we take simply the word dharma, for example, then dharma translated as religion is simply a bad translation. It is not a problem of untranslatability, it is simply laziness. We have not understood the word in a particular context, because we know dharma in different contexts would mean absolutely different things. Okay? It might mean duty, it might mean human nature, it has 56 different meanings within the tradition. So, if you are not really understanding the context and using it simply as religion or duty or whatever, then obviously you are a bad translator. Whether certain elements are really untranslatable, they are, and that is why we struggle, for example. Okay, for example, if you have more than 2 or 3 languages in our head, so again I am sure that all of you do that, we have a term in Bangla, the Bangla people from Bangladesh would understand, which is almost untranslatable. So, do not ask me to explain what it means, okay, but I will write it down for your listening, and if the Bengali speaking friends can help me translate it, please do. So, there is a word in Bengali called naka. It is primarily used for women, okay, designating a certain kind of a quality that a woman has, not a very positive one, it is a negative word. Okay. Translate. It is not that bad, it is not that negative. So, you can see there is this struggle. So, it can mean a bit of snobbishness, a bit of dramatic attitude, a bit of play acting that you are doing, melodramatic, bit of coquettishness, etc. Okay. So, it could mean many of these things together. So, it is almost an ensemble of meanings which is separated in English. So, certain words which are very culturally rooted would be extremely difficult to translate, and therefore, what translators tend to do is to not translate it and give a footnote that these are the possible meanings of the word. For example, the word Dayan is often translated, in Bengali the word is Daini, is often translated as witch. They're completely different words. I mean, the good witch never existed, it existed only after a certain point of time. Witches were always bad. But yes, but the witch carries a completely different cultural connotation, Dayan has a completely different cultural connotation, etc. Yeah. So some of them are what translators would do, a good translator would rather not translate and give the cultural context in which it is used. So that probably is a better strategy to use.
While teaching language, wouldn't it create a homogeneous situation that, okay, like, I mean, it's very subtle, but you know, if we do it for longer, then it will almost create a kind of problem.
If you are using translation exclusively in the classroom, then
Not translation, but what I'm saying, if we are acquiring one language, let's say foreign language, I don't know if we can consider English a foreign language. Can we?
there's a debate, but
Debate, so I will not get into it, but a kind of, let's say, which is non-native. Native, when I say very, for example, English is not a language of South Chhattisgarh, let's say, but we are acquiring it. So there are many words from Halbi, Bhadri, which is not, translatable. But because I acquired English, and now when I'm interacting with that, I'm not able to interact with that in that manner. And this is happening, like how my grandfather used to interact with that. The younger generation is not interacting because they know English.
but that is bound to happen. No? Any kind of a language change would bound to happen.
Can we not address it? That was my question.
Is there a possibility of addressing it? Yes, there is a possibility of addressing it. Can we address it as a mass phenomenon? It's difficult. Primarily because what happens is the moment you start learning other languages, I mean, why get into English at all? For example, since you mentioned South Chhattisgarh, it has a large number of other forms of languages than the standard Hindi, for example. But you did learn Hindi, right? So there is the first distanciation that already has happened. So you have learned a standard language and then moved away from the other languages. The second distanciation happens when you learn English or any other language for that matter. Yeah? Now the question is whether you are going to see it as a distancing from the other language or a different kind of perspective to understand that language in that sense. In fact, sir and I were having a discussion on this. So for example, if I go back to Calcutta, now I go pretty frequently, but there was a time when I used to go back after 3-4 years. And sometimes the phraseology that was getting used, for example, among the young generation, I just couldn't relate to it because I didn't know what they were talking about. Okay? But that is bound to happen in any language. So any language will keep on evolving. So we really can't relate to a language as we think, because language is not static, so it will keep on changing. So the languages that you are talking about that you feel you are not able to relate to because you have learnt other languages is not static in itself. It is also dynamic. It has also changed in different ways. Okay, and if you are not aware of those dynamicity of changes, then I mean, it will be anyway difficult for you to relate to. Can we address it? Yes, but then we'll have to do comparative linguistics. So how languages change, etc. So maybe one of the methods of doing it is we do a comparative linguistic study of different kinds of things that are happening in both the languages. Sorry, you had a question.
In relation with textbooks and technology, nowadays, how long?
For a purpose I'm telling you.
This is getting recorded, that's why. Yeah.
And also, we need some photos. Take some. When she's asking a question, take some photos.
Okay, in relation with the textbooks and technology, how long a textbooks, the life of a textbooks nowadays in classroom, because we are with very much changing, and also if it is kind of questioning the use of textbooks, because also, you know, the teacher or the professor has their own way of creativity of how to teach. And then also this idea of standardization of one text for everybody. So these things.
So, thank you. The question that this is a big debate right now. So, can you use completely? I mean, do you believe in people like Sugata Mitra, who say that technology should take over? So, there are scholars who say that since technology is here, we can simply replace the textbooks with technology. I don't know how feasible that is. Again, across countries with different kinds of resources, I don't think how far that's going to work. Including many European countries that I know of generations of teachers still today who would not touch technology at all. They would still actually prefer a textbook to technology, etc. So, the question therefore is not so much whether technology, I mean textbooks can keep pace with technology and change themselves. I don't think that that's that's a very good question to ask in a sense, to as a teacher or as a practitioner. Maybe what we can do is we can think of technology as a supplement. So, of course, there has to be some sort of a material that you are going to bring to the class, but technology can supplement it because there is a lot of stuff out there. The second thing is, and this is again a big debate, and let me just place this debate in front of you so that everyone is aware of it. People think that technology is a tool, okay? So, and it can be used as a tool. It is not true philosophically speaking, because technology does change you. There was a period in India for a very long time when the companies that used to sell watches suffered quite a lot, and I am sure this was a global phenomenon. Once the mobile phones started having these clocks, people just stopped buying watches. So, it is not the way you communicate, your sense of time, your sense of space, all these things that are so human to us change. So, technology is not simply a tool, it is also, as in philosophy it is called, it is both epistemological, it is a form of knowledge, and it changes your ontology, it changes the way you are, the being. Yeah. So, even if we say in language teaching very casually that technology can be used as a supplement, it does not remain a supplement all the time, because it changes the way you think. And I am sure that people who come from my generation, when we walk into a classroom nowadays, it is a very different experience, let us say from 10 years back, because students, and for example in this classroom, I mean most of you would probably, the moment I write something on the board, would probably go and check what is there, yeah, because the information is available. So, the knowledge transaction that is happening, the knowledge exchange that is happening has taken a different route now, okay? And it is not like knowledge exchange as it used to happen earlier. So, these kind of subtle changes will always be there. Can textbooks keep pace with that? I doubt it. I really doubt it. I am very, very doubtful, because as I said, technology changes every 2 minutes. The textbooks can't. I mean, you can't really keep pace with technology in a certain sense. Very interesting questions. Any other questions?
What about apps like Duolingo? How efficient are they? Because I have used it to learn to
Yeah.
languages, and I think
Yeah.
they were good at it, basically.
I mean, Duolingo for basic language learning, I think is excellent. I mean, because again, a personal anecdote which I don't like giving, but my son actually learned French on Duolingo. He is now learning Spanish on Duolingo. So,
It was good, and basic
it's basic level. It's, see, these kind of apps, what we call apps, or platforms if you want to call them, they are based on this idea of LLM, so language learning models. Yeah? They do not really create material, but they look at the amount of material that is there on the web. We will look at one of the research methods today where the web becomes a massive storehouse of languages. So, what they do is they draw from that storehouse the spoken variety, the writing variety, etc., etc. And once you have these big language learning data banks, then you can create these kind of apps. One of our common friends, Girish Jha, some of you might know him. Has he come here? So Girish Ji, no, he's not. So he was extremely interested in computational linguistics. Okay? So what he is trying to do is he is trying to create these massive data banks of, let's say, regional languages of India, of Hindi, Odia, Gujarati, Bangla, etc. He's no more there. Still recently he was there. And they are trying to create this huge data bank which can be used for different purposes, for learning a language, for translation purposes, for creating technical vocabulary, etc., etc. Because a large number of, one of the things that the current education policy in India focuses on is that all subjects should also be available in local regional languages. Now, in order to, you really can't ask people to translate it, it's going to take years to do it. So, it has to be machine translation, but the machine needs to have the language to translate it. And one of his common complaints, I hope I am not giving him away, was that we just do not have enough of these languages on the net. So, where are we going to draw the data from, including Hindi? He says we keep on talking about Hindi, but we hardly write anything on Hindi on the net. So, he says for Sanskrit it is not a problem because I already have a ready-made grammar and the grammar can create forms of Sanskrit forms. But what do I do with Hindi? What do I do with Bangla? Bangla is the fifth I think now, fifth spoken language in the world, okay? Because it belongs to two countries actually. And still you have a dearth of data in Bangla. So, if you want to create an app, it is going to draw from this data that is available on the internet. Where are you going to get it if it is not there? So, I mentioned him primarily because he, in every conference, in every lecture, he would say, please write in your local languages, please write in Hindi, please write in, so that we have some data so that we can create these apps and etc. I think he has left now. So he came back to James. Any other comment or question? No? Okay. So, today I thought since today is the last day, I will just tell you some research possibilities which are happening now. Some of them you already would know, some I have already pointed out in my previous talks that we had. For example, the history of English language education is one topic that is becoming important to understand what is happening in terms of language teaching. So, what I will do is I will kind of give you pointers and I hope some of you will take it up and research on your own. Of course, I have sent you materials on this, sir has shared them with you, I am sure, and so you can read up on what is really happening in these fields in a certain way. So, what I am going to talk about is corpus linguistics. Anyone who is aware of corpus linguistics? Can we have a show of hands? Corpus linguistics? No, they are not done. The second thing I am going to talk about is multimodal analysis, which is a kind of a move away from what we did with technology. The third that I am going to do, I am sure that many of you have heard about this one, critical discourse analysis, and the fourth one is what is known as teacher research. This is a big different. Okay? It has recently become quite important, maybe after 2010 or 15 maybe. Corpus linguistics is old, so let us begin with that. What is corpus linguistics? Let me just start with a definition. It is primarily the study of language or linguistic phenomena through the analysis of data obtained from a corpus. What is a corpus? A corpus is a collection or a data bank of languages. Okay? So, I can, for example, have a corpus of English. I can also have specialized corpus. For example, I can have a corpus of spoken English. Okay? So, when the initial corpus was getting created, corpora in plural, so when initial corpora were getting created, people would actually go with tape recorders, okay, and say that, ask permission from people that we would like to record your conversation. They would go back, transcribe those conversations. I think some of this you must have learnt in your research methods, this idea of collection of data, etc. So, they would collect it, put it upon a computer, then computer had a special software which I will mention later, which could then analyze the sentences, okay, grammatically. So, there were processes called collocation, colligation, etc., frequency. So, those kind of things could be done. Now, remember there was corpus of all languages. So, you can have English, French, German, as long as you have material, you can have a corpus. Okay. So, I will just show you some examples of corpus, you could just visit them, some of them unfortunately are paid. So, what are the different kinds of corpora, the plural of corpus are available? Now, the most unfortunate part is most of them are paid, okay. Primarily because remember, to collect this data people have to spend quite a lot of money, okay. But to kind of preempt what I am going to say later, you will not find any dictionary today, any recent edition of a dictionary, especially after 2010, which does not use a corpus. Okay. In fact, in the preface to the dictionaries, you will see that they have mentioned that these are the specific corpora that we have used for creating these dictionaries. If you know about the history of dictionary creation, the field was called lexicography. So, if you know about the history of dictionary creation, one of the first dictionaries that was created in English, which is generally considered to be the first standard dictionary, it was not standard at all, was by someone called Dr. Johnson. Okay. And in 1755, he created this dictionary called the Dictionary of the English Language. Okay. It is quite a stupendous dictionary, okay, because this person did not have access to any of this at all, no corpus. He simply sat down every day and his own understanding of the word was put as the meaning in the dictionary. Okay. He also gave variations. So, for example, the same word in Ireland would be used in this way, in Scotland would be used in this way, etc. So, it was a phenomenal job. He almost died doing it. But of course, you also find extremely funny things in it. Okay. For example, it defines the cigarette as a white stick that has a fire at one end and a fool's mouth at the other. Which is obviously very subjective, which is not supposed to be there in a, you will never find this in a modern dictionary. Okay. He defines oats, oats, he defines oats as this is something that is eaten by people in Ireland and by horses in England. Okay. So, sometimes extremely biased definitions, etc. Yeah. So, he also, the dictionary carried his own subjectivity. It is a very funny dictionary to go through some of the words especially. In fact, it defines fire, the meaning of the fire he gives is even more funny. He says fire is a disastrous conflagration. Now, I do not know whether the meaning is more difficult than the word or what it is. So, he says the fire is a disastrous conflagration, okay, etc. So, as you can see, of course, he did not have access to all these large data banks at that point of time. He was working through his own intuition of meanings and doing it. With the availability of corpus now, you have huge amounts of data available and you know exactly how the word is used in different contexts in different variations. Okay? And therefore, all dictionaries use a corpus to produce meanings of words, etc. What are the major ones that are available? Now, if you want to really access some of them give you some free access, but most of them are paid. And they are actually, you can't even go to the site and say I am ready to pay, because they are processed through distribution agencies. So, you will have to go to the distribution agency site, ask for access. You can ask for limited access, full access. Full access is extremely expensive, but you can ask for limited access. And people who are working or researching corpus to do certain things, they generally get institutional support to do it. Yeah? Now, some of these corpus are this International Computer Archive of Modern and Medieval English. So, if you are working on modern and medieval English, then this is one of the sites that you can go to. All of them have websites. The second one is LDC, the Linguistic Data Consortium. This is a multilingual corpus. Okay? And when I say multilingual, it's not simply, it's not Indian languages or southern languages, but multilingual in the sense of European languages. So, it has French, German, Spanish, Portuguese. I think they have added a few more now. So, the 4 major languages are there. I think they have added Norwegian now and some others. The third one is what is known as the Oxford Text Archive. This is mostly English, but it might also have Welsh, a bit of Welsh. Yeah. The fourth one, so these are again, remember, mostly paid. You have to pay to access the data, but there are quite a few which are free. This one is one. It's called Open Language Archives Community. Oh, the L should have been capital. Anyway, now this is a multilingual collection. Okay. Again, not Indian languages, but mostly European languages. Yeah. This, you can simply visit this site, and you need to know what to do on the corpus site. I will try to show you what happens on a corpus site. So, you just visit this site, and then you have to do certain things, because you need to have certain questions in your mind before you visit the corpus site. The question could be grammatical, they could be about vocabulary. So, one of the first, let me tell you a story. One of the first uses of corpus was actually put in the University of Birmingham, okay, in England. So, there was this professor over there, whose name I have completely forgotten now, but I am sure you will be able to find him on Google. So, this person, he had a lot of international students, 1980s, and these students would come and ask him, so what is the difference between this word and this word, or why is this grammatically incorrect? For a very long time, he used to answer intuitively. Okay? He was a native speaker, so he would say, oh, this is right because this is how it is, etc. But he said that this is becoming boring because I am working only intuitively. There should be some rule that I should be able to guide them to. So, he created his own mini corpus, applied the software, which I am going to show you later, to and then when the students came to him to ask these questions, he would simply say, go to the corpus and find out. It reduced his workload primarily, but he also found out later, he did a study on this, that students actually learned what he was doing with intuition was sometimes not confirmed by the corpus at all. Okay? So, for example, he would say things like, these words are very common in English, but the corpus said otherwise, that no, these are not, okay, etc. So, then he became interested, was kind of a part of a larger group of corpus building, which was called the Collins-Cobild corpus, on which, if you are aware of this dictionary called the Collins-Cobild dictionary. So, Collins-Cobild dictionary is based on the corpus that this professor and others developed. Anyway, so what are the major corpora in English? I am just going to stick to the English. So, first of all, there is something called the general language corpora. Now, these are spoken and written languages. Okay? Now, again, just to reiterate, a corpus is a collection of huge amounts of languages in a storeroom. Okay? So, it is stored on a computer. So, some of the early corpora that you find is, for example, the brown corpus of written American English. As the name suggests, they will tell you what the corpus is about. The Lancaster Oslo Bergen corpus of written British English, the Wellington corpus of written New Zealand English, the Australian corpus of English, which is, of course, you also have the British National Corpus, the American National Corpus now. And you also have in these early days the Kolhapur corpus of Indian English. Okay. So, there is this famous scholar who worked on Indian English. His name, he was a linguist. His name was Bhattacharya. Have they done Bhattacharya's name?
Nothing on linguistics.
Oh, nothing on linguistics. Okay. So, we were a bit worried, both of us, that I mean, one of the ways into world literatures probably is linguistics. I mean, you really can't do world literatures without some grounding in linguistics. So, maybe sometime later you will have linguistics. Bhattacharya has a very famous book called The Indianization of English. Okay? So, how Indians use English. So, what he did was he actually used this corpus. This is mostly a written corpus of literature written in English by Indian writers. That was easy to create. All these books are available on print, you just transfer them into onto the computer. So, what Kachru did was he looked at different aspects, grammatical aspects, lexical aspects, grammato-lexical aspects of the language, and how Indian writers was using English, and he created this book called The Indianization of English. So, how in fact it is this book that made Indian English as an acceptable variety of world Englishes, okay, etc. Okay. So, he had a major influence on what we call Indian English today, which again is a misnomer, because Indian English can be very different across parts of the country, but he managed to create what he called was the standard variations in Indian English. So, it is a very interesting study. If you do get a chance, it is a very readable book, it is not a very technical book. So, it is not a very technical linguistics book. I think it is a good book to read. Okay. What happens, what were these corpus about? To give you a size of the corpus, they generally consist of around 1 million words, all these corpuses, all these corpora. So, what you have is basically 500 texts, and that is the formula. So, you have 500 texts into 2000 words. So, you can't keep all texts. So, you take just 500 texts of about 2000 words, and then you put them in the corpus, and then you keep on adding as the data bank grows. Okay. Later, of course, there was also an awareness that language is not simply written or spoken, because with the coming of technology, there was a lot of multimedia languages. For example, nowadays when we write whatever we write on especially platforms that are electronically mediated, we often use not just written text. We will use audio, we might use a video to supplement what we are saying. Of course, emojis are very common. So, these have acquired a linguistic feature of their own. So, people realize that instead of simply having spoken and written text, you can also have what they called multimedia corpus. Okay. And these were something, we will talk about this is another mode of doing research. So, these produce what were known as multimodal texts. One of the most accessible one and free one is ELISA. It's English language interview corpus as a second language application. So, it's basically a large number of interviews that were taken, which also analyzes not only the spoken language, but also things like facial gestures, hand movements, body postures, etc., etc. So, other kinds of non-verbal features that are part of your speech or whatever, of your communication. Yeah. But of course, you don't have to do all this, because now the internet, the World Wide Web itself is a corpus. It's the largest collection of language that you can ever have. Okay? So, most of the corpora now depend on the web. Okay? So, what you can then therefore do is you can treat the web as a corpus itself. But of course, you can't do anything about it, because you need to know the technicalities of how to use it as a corpus. I will just tell you some things about it. Of course, it is a massive one. Now, for doing this, you need a special software which is again available free. So, you can try it at your spare time, in your spare time. You can simply download this and use this software on different sorts of web platforms, and it will do an activity called concordancing. I will try to explain what concordancing is. So, these require a web concordancer. What is concordancing? Concordancing is something like what we used to say very long time back in Latin grammar, if you remember. We used to call it do you remember this parsing? Anyone who has done parsing? No, they have not done. Parsing is basically, as the word suggests, it is separating grammatical elements of a sentence. Okay? So, I do not want to get into linguistics, but I have no option over here. So, just bear with me for 2 minutes. So, if I write a simple sentence like this, I went to a school. Okay? Now, of course, this is one grammatical element, right? But remember, this is 2 grammatical elements. This contains the basic verb go, but also contains a past tense marker, right? This is another grammatical element. This grammatical element, of course, can function in different ways in English. Okay? Here it is functioning as a numeral, as a numerical, as something that indicates a number. Yeah? And this is another grammatical element. So, what parsing helps you to do is it kind of separates the grammatical elements. So, though you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the actual grammatical elements in the sentences are 7, because you have a numeral functioning which can function in different ways, and you have a past tense functioning which is added. So, though you have 5 words, but you have 7 grammatical forms. Okay? You can do a lexical parsing also, but let us not get into that. So, I have just shown you the example of grammatical parsing. Concordancing is something like that. So, it kind of separates elements of the language. That is what it does. These are some free ones that you can use. These are concordancing softwares, WebCorp, WebQuick, and QuickFinder. Yeah? I think I have shared this presentation, so you can have a look. Yeah? So, and QuickFinder. So, these are free software. You can simply download it and use it on the web, and it will do things for you. What does it do? It can do different sorts of things. For example, it can give you frequency counts. If you want to find out how frequent is a word in English, it will give you a frequency count of that word. Okay? What else can it do? If you want to find out things like what does a certain word combine with most in English, okay? What is known as collocation, if you remember collocation. So, a word that is close to another word. For example, an example of collocation in English is bread and butter. So, these 2 words go together. Yeah? So, if you want to find out a particular word, what does it collocate with, it can do that. If you also want to do what is known as colligation, colligation is what is the grammatical partner of a word. So, you can have a lexical partner, but you can also have a grammatical partner. So, which word, which grammatical element goes with the word most commonly. It can give you that colligation as well. If you want to simply understand how a word is used in English, you simply type in the word, and I would suggest that you go to
Even an example of colligation.
oh, colligation. Okay. The simplest definition of colligation, I'll try to think of an example. A simplest definition of colligation, this is the term. Is the grammatical company that the word keeps. Okay? You think of an example, and there are many in my head, but I'm trying to think of an example that completely fits this corpus. So how do you find the colligation? So how do you find out the grammatical company? I'll give you a very different example, but can you think of an example that? No? Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, I'll give you two words, okay, and I would like you to tell me where do you think does this word most likely to get used, okay, grammatically, right? These are exceptions to the rule, but I thought this is more fun. Just. All of you know the meaning of the word just. It can be indicative of time, but it can also be indicative of, it can also act as a noun, right? Sorry, as an adjective. Okay. Oh, you got it. The most common usage of the word just is actually what is known as a semantic nullity. A semantic nullity is a word which gets used but doesn't have a meaning. This is the most common usage of word in English. So you will say things like, I just went there, so you use it as a kind of filler, okay, which doesn't have any meaning over there. The same thing has happened, what has happened with just, the same thing has happened especially after 2008-9 in American English with the word like. So now in American English it's very common to say I like went there and I like did that. Like doesn't mean anything over there at all. So it doesn't have any colligatory capabilities, though it used to have. So things can have properties of colligation, but may lose it. Okay? So I'm sure that if you have watched this series called Friends, it was popularized through that series because everyone in that, all the characters in that series keep on using the word like with semantic nullity. There is no meaning. They will say, I like went there. Their like doesn't mean anything. It simply means I went there. But like is a filler over there, indicative of a certain kind of a, well, it has meaning. It has a meaning that it belongs to a certain kind of a lingo used by a certain kind of people living in a certain kind of city. But in terms of a grammatical meaning, it has lost its capability. So I hope this makes colligation a bit clear. So you might have colligations, but corpus can throw you very interesting answers. So when our intuition tells us that just has a certain kind of a usage, of course it has other kinds of usage also. But the most common usage of American and British English will tell you now that just has become this semantic nullity. It doesn't carry, the most frequent use is as a filler, as something that fills in a sentence, etc. So very interesting forms of insights that it can give you. How can we use it for research? For doing different kinds of things. Okay? If you are interested in doing grammatical analysis, if you are trying to help students, if you are a teacher, if you want to give examples of real life, remember these are real life examples, these are authentic texts. They are actual speeches and writing that are there outside in the world. So, if you are trying to give them examples of authentic text, corpus is the best one. If you want to teach them a particular grammatical item, corpus. If you want to teach them lexical items or lists of words, corpus, because the words can then be contextualized and the students can read it and come back to the class, etc. So, it has various kinds of usage. It also gives you insights in the changing nature of language. Okay. So, if you are interested, for example, unfortunately, we do not, and this is what our common friend was trying to do, create a corpus of Indian languages. Okay. Because if you don't have that, it's impossible humanly to do it. I'll tell you another story to make you understand that. So, there was this person called Michael West. Okay. Bangladesh friends, Michael West. He was the education officer in Dhaka in 1930s. No? Okay. So, he started his career, of course, with the British government. He was appointed as an education officer in Dhaka, and you know what education officers do. They go and supervise teaching, monitor what is happening in the area, etc. So, when he used to go into these schools, suburban schools primarily around Dhaka, he found out that children are not simply learning anything. Okay. They simply come to the school and go back. So, he said there is not enough interesting material in the class. Okay. So, he sat down one fine day, then he came to Calcutta, travelled to went to Chennai as well. He started producing what in those days were called graded readers. Okay. It is a very common practice in language teaching now. Okay. They are called graded readers. What are graded readers? The belief that West had was that the children are not interested in learning because the textbooks are too difficult for their levels. These children come from different sorts of backgrounds, speaking different sorts of languages, and then you suddenly introduce them to a textbook which is absolutely foreign to them. Okay. So, what he did was he created what he called frequency lists. Remember, no computers, 1930s. So, he said, I will create intuitively almost, also consulting a large number of dictionaries, the most common words in terms of frequency that are used in English. He created a list of around 200, and then he divided them. The most common frequently used words in English are now, because computers are there, we know are articles and prepositions. Okay. So, articles and prepositions are the most frequently used grammatical items in English. He actually created them out of intuition. Okay. And then he said, I will create stories based on first the most frequent words, then the lesser frequent words, then the even lesser frequent words, etc., etc. And then I will go on to complex words. These are called graded readers because there is a from simple to complex readers. Yeah? So, these are graded readers. And he did a whole experiment with this. So, we would actually go to the poorest of schools in and around Bangladesh, later in Calcutta and then in Chennai, and actually teach those texts. Remember, he was a government officer, he had government things to do. So, he would call these children even in the evenings and sit with them and then teach them through these texts. He never wrote about it. In those days, of course, remember, publication was not very important. So, but he talked about his experience, and he was found out almost 40 years later that this person has already done something that we are talking about today in a situation where English was not even the first language. Okay. Later, of course, graded reading became an important aspect of language teaching, and with the coming of corpus, graded readers became much more easy to make. Okay. But this is what West did in the 20s and 30s. Unfortunately, Um, I have talked to a large number of people from Bangladesh and they don't know West, which is surprising because he almost brought in a revolution in what we call language teaching. And therefore, when we were talking about materials production, one of the things that I said was there were different pathways of materials production. One was this also. So, he started doing this in the 1920s and 30s. That is, and I mentioned West primarily because I wanted to say, coming back to web, the web can also be used for creating these kind of readers, graded readers, if you really want to help them. Okay. And then if you know the research method, social science research methods, for example, you can take the text, there is something called an intervention. So, you do 30 hours of teaching or 60 hours of teaching, you give them a pre-test, a post-test, you compare the results and see whether their English has improved. That can itself become a study in its own. Yeah? So, again the corpus can help. So, this is one. The second possibility of doing research on is what we call multimodal analysis. Now, this realization came that languages cannot be treated simply as written and spoken text, especially after the 1980s and 1990s with the coming of technology. Because most of the things that you now encounter are not simply text. It is more likely that you will encounter a multimodal text. So, it uses different sorts of media. Okay. So, you might have a written text. I am sure that many of you are on Facebook, but I am also sure that many of you are on Instagram, because that is the one. How many of you are on Insta? Almost everyone. A question that I would like to ask, why are you on Insta? It's become extremely popular. Remember, it's just 4 or 5 years phenomenon, not more than that. Why are you on Insta? Can we have some responses, please?
I should be seen like
Yeah, okay, to be seen. And that's the key word, isn't it? Because Insta allows you to see, but also allows you to be seen, because that is the key word. Okay. So, it is the visual that is more important in Insta, and therefore, Insta has so many things like filters, you can modify, you can avatars, you can have different sorts of, you can change your complete profile and present yourself as something else on Insta, etc. Yeah. Now, if someone says that this is because Insta has its own language, so how do you analyze that language? That itself is a different kind of a linguistic phenomenon that is happening. So, Insta will have texts, written texts, but it mostly depends on a visual picture. Yeah? In that case, should you completely ignore the picture and say, I am a linguist and therefore I am going to just look at the text, or do you have some sort of a mechanism to also understand how the picture interacts with the text? This is also the philosophy of what are known as memes. I am sure that all of you have seen memes. Meme format is primarily an image text format. There is an image interacting with the text. But if you think about it very carefully, that is also the format of all advertisements. You have an image and a text. Okay, that is the format of all advertisements. So, what multimodal analysis does, I will try to explain this to you very quickly. It does not treat only written text as text. It treats any kind of an object which has the possibility of communicating as a text. So, it could be a picture, it could be anything else, could be an image, etc. It starts around 1990s and it is picked up quite a lot of pace now, because people have realized that if you are doing linguistic analysis, if you are trying to understand language, because the classroom has changed, our students and your students possibly sometime later no longer simply read texts, they read images. Yeah? And therefore, we need to address that even within the classroom itself, and how do we make it into a pedagogy. So, that is what multimodal analysis does. I will just give you a model This was started by someone called Gunther Kress, whose article I have shared with you to give you an idea of what multimodal analysis does. So, it basically is a linguistic exploration, but this is what a model looks like. So, this is Kress's model of what he calls an integrated multimodal approach. So, as you can see it, it's like a Venn diagram with two circles. So, Kress says that in order to understand today's communication, you need to have at least these three. Okay. First of all, what is the technical orientation of the text? Instagram will allow certain things to happen, will not allow certain other things to happen. Twitter, for a very long time, for example, did not allow more than 140 characters. Now, of course, it allows 280. Similarly, different sorts of platforms will have different sorts of technical orientation. In technological language, in language of technical analysis, they are called affordances. So, every platform has an affordance. It allows you to do certain things, it does not allow you to do certain other things. Okay. So, every technological platform will have that. Okay. And it is not only technological platform, any kind of an image text format, even if it is printed, will have affordances. Okay. In an advertisement, you can't have huge amounts of text and a little picture. The picture should predominate, and the byline, as it is called, should be little. Okay. So, it should have a punchline, etc. So, there are affordances that every advertisement has. Okay. And that is something that we need to understand before we even try analyzing these kind of text. So, there is a technical orientation to it. There is of course a social orientation, and we are aware of that. For example, the use of women in advertisements to sell products. So, there is a kind of a socio-cultural text embedded within that. So, we need to also analyze that. And of course, there is a socio-historical orientation. People read images in different socio-cultural conditions in different ways. I will give you an example from India. When photographs became extremely popular by the 1850s or so, it started entering India. Before that, remember, you have something called landscapes, which captures reality. Okay. So, if you know about a bit of a history of painting in India from the colonial times, and I am not going into pre-colonial times because there is a huge history of painting there. But during the colonial times, there were these what were known as company painters. Okay. So, the East India Company actually used to employ painters, and this style of painting was called company painting, okay, or company art. Okay. What did these painters do? They would go to different parts of the country. For example, they will come to Patna and then paint in a realistic manner the different buildings that the British have constructed, or maybe the flora and the fauna of the local region. Okay. And you have a huge collection. If you just Google company art, you will see there is a huge collection of painters who were paid by the company, later got royal patronage, for example, and were extremely popular not only in India, across South Asia. In Hong Kong, they were very popular. Okay. So, they were specially called from India to paint Hong Kong flora and fauna, the Hong Kong landscape, etc. Because these paintings were valued for their realism. They were real. They contained reality of the colonial state. When photography came in, these painters became redundant. Okay. So, what you have therefore is, with photography there is a new way of seeing. Now, you can see things not through someone else's eyes, but something that is a direct experience. So, a photograph is supposed to be more authentic than a painting. Okay. And photography started spreading. So, if you go to a royal palace even today, okay, what you will notice is this very interesting socio-historical transition. So, all these kings and sometimes queens will have these massive portraits on the wall, and I am sure that you have seen this across palaces and forts in India, so these massive portraits on the wall. But as time progresses by the 1870s and 80s, you will also see a small part of the house which has different activities captured in photographs. These photographs are different from the painting. I mean, I can go on with this, but just to show you a difference in seeing. The paintings are supposed to impress. So, this man with a big moustache and a turban and the most royal regalia with holding a staff, sometimes sitting on a tiger skin or something, or is looking back at you like this. So, that is the royal painting, that is the royal posture. Okay. So, it is meant to impress you. The photographs collection of the same royal palace is meant to capture reality. Okay. So, these are real. So, the person going hunting, so you will have a lot of photographs of hunting, for example. So, the person holding a gun with a lion or a tiger dead, or a person celebrating a wedding or whatever, So, all these things. So, that is a different way of seeing. So, a photograph is supposed to show you reality, while the painting, so that distinction is already made when photography comes. Okay. Before that, paintings kind of replaced what photography did, capture reality. Now, paintings are seen as an exaggeration of reality that should impress you, because you have another technology that can capture reality more authentically than a painting can. Yeah. And these kind of things also need to be understood in the context of how we read an image. Okay. To give you another example, when newspapers first started producing, putting in photographs as a part of their writing. Remember, newspapers before photography came in just had writing, right? You might have sketches, but mostly writing, written text. So, when photography becomes popular, you have picture. I am sure that when you put up a photograph, it asks you for something called a caption. Have you ever thought why it asks you for a caption? Because the photograph already has it, right? It already has captured whatever you want to show.
So it's like the algorithm of that application, and whatever the words we will put in that caption, the audience which is interested in that, the content will display on there.
So, another socio-historical change. The caption now is algorithmic. The caption now is a hashtag that can draw the kind of people that you would like to draw to yourselves. Okay? So, it produces a different kind of a viewing experience. The caption is not there basically to explain what the photograph is, but when newspapers first started publishing photographs, the caption was used to explain what the photograph is, because people did not have experience of looking at a picture. So, they had to explain what the picture was. So, the captions were primarily used as a meaning making device. They wanted you to read the photograph in a certain way, etc. Okay. So, these kind of socio-historical developments are something that multimodal analysis looks at. We will come to this junction later. The second part of the circle is multimodal analysis also believes that the combination of different kinds of media is also dependent on what they call identity interests. Okay. So, different kind of groups or communities can produce different sorts of combinations of image and text depending on, of course, all of this, the social orientation, the socio-historical orientation, this is an influence. And so, the way you produce an image, the way you produce a text will depend not only on your history and the social and cultural condition that you come from, but also it forms your identity in a certain way. And this is especially true in today's age, because as one of my friends who works with digital cultures, says that we don't really know who people are. We, it's impossible to know, because sometimes you very cleverly hide it in what you are on Facebook or what you are on Instagram, etc. Yeah? The second thing I already talked about affordance a bit. So, multimedia texts also have what they call a mode. Okay? Anyone who can explain mode?
The way that media is presented.
So, it's basically the way every media will have a certain kind of a way of presentation. Okay? So, YouTube has a certain way of presentation, Facebook will have a different one. I am taking technological examples because all of you are familiar with it, but even an advertisement will have a different mode of presentation, print media will have a different mode of presentation, and therefore a different affordance. So, all these things need to be kept in mind. Just to give you an example of this, very interesting example, all of you know about this Lewis Carroll text called Alice in Wonderland. Yeah? Now, Alice in Wonderland was written, Carroll finished writing it, but he said that this was meant for children, so it should have pictures. And he waited for 5 years because the person he wanted to draw the pictures for Alice was not free. He did not give him time. But finally he agreed, and 5 years down the line he drew the pictures, and then the text was published. It will be interesting to read because both the versions are available, Alice in Wonderland without the pictures and Alice in Wonderland with the pictures. Okay? It changes your reading experience because the pictures kind of give you a different kind of, not only flavor, a different kind of reading the text, because you are reading both the image and the text at the same time. Okay? While you are when you are simply reading the text, and that is the experience that I am sure that many of you had. You had a favorite book, and then if it is turned into a film, you have extremely violent reactions to it. You either hate it or love it. I have never met a person who says it was okay. It's either it was terrible or it is really good. And I am sure that you had these experiences, because this transformation of a text into an image also changes the way you read a text, etc. Sorry. Of course, every image text or multimedia text will have a design. It will have a multimodal ensemble, so that needs to be understood. So, you also need to be aware of how things are designed in different sorts of media. That also produces the meaning. For example, if you foreground the picture and the text is in the background, you will read it in a different way if you foreground the text and the picture is in the background. It's a different kind of reading, etc. So, all these produce the compositional principle, affordance of the platform, all these things are there. So, all these things need to be taken into consideration when you are doing a multimodal analysis. Okay? It is not simply the text, but all these things. What are the methods that are used? What Gunther Kress, and it is there in the article that I have shared with you, he calls it a social semiotic framework. Okay? It is primarily ethnographic. Have they done ethnography? No, okay. Ethnography is a research method which basically comes from social sciences. It is known by different names. It is primarily when a researcher goes and spends time with the actual object of study. Okay? It could be a community, it could be a village, it could be anything. It could be a social ritual, it could be people who are singing songs, it could be anything primarily. Okay? So, what Kress says that instead of simply intuiting how a text is produced, it is much better to what he calls an ethnographic social semiotic framework. So, you will have to go to people who are creating these kind of texts. So, there is, because of Kress now, there is something now called a digital ethnography. So, digital ethnography is, for example, if my research question is how do women in Nalanda University use social media? So, it is a gender question. I am trying to find out in terms of gender, how do women use social media in this. Now, of course, when I use the category women, then it is extremely homogeneous, because there are different kinds of women, and then I can start dividing it. So, how do I divide it? So, do I divide it in terms of nationalities? Do I divide them into terms of caste? Do I divide them in terms of class? Do I divide them in terms of whatever, race, etc., etc. Yeah. So, once I do that, then I can start spending time with women within this community, and ethnographic methods can be different. So, I can take up a case study, for example. Okay, so I can do I can choose 5 women on the campus, and I do a case study with them. For a period of time, it could be very long, which is called a longitudinal study. So, I can spend 5 years with them and find out what are their practices of using social media, or it could be a short term study where I study them for 3 months or 4 months, and then I found out. And during this, of course, I interact with them constantly. Okay. There are different sorts of data collection methods. One could be interviews, I simply interview them, or I could even request them to donate what is known as data donation. So, they donate data of their social media use. I cannot force them to do anything, remember, that is unethical. But there is also now in digital ethnography something called data mining. Okay. So, which data mining primarily is, I request permission to add these 5 women, 5 case studies I am studying to, all of us belong to a group, and I say that what you do is you mimic your social media practice on this group as well. So, that creates a whole data set, and I can data mine it and use it for researching gender, how different sorts of nationalities or whatever use data or use the social media on the campus. Okay. This kind of analysis is what Kress is suggesting. So, it is a social semiotic. He does not use simply a semiotic framework. It is he says any kind of a multimedia text is primarily a social product. Okay. And therefore, you really cannot separate it and say we are just going to do a textual analysis. It has to be connected to how this text gets generated, what are the relations, what are the ideologies of these generations, etc. So, all these questions come in multimodal analysis. Okay. Do read the article, it will be quite an interesting one. Let us come to the third one, which I think you were mentioning yesterday. You said you did critical discourse analysis in Bangladesh, right? Yeah. Now, critical discourse analysis, I will start with the definition. It studies opaque as well as transparent structural relationships of dominance, discrimination, power and control as manifested in language. And this is in a Ruth Wodak book, whose article I think I have shared, no, I have shared the Blomert article with you. So, Ruth Wodak is one of the persons who is the founders of critical discourse analysis, though the person who really started it off was a person called Norman Fairclough, whose model we are going to see. What does it do? Now, remember, this is again a language analysis. Okay. It is not really a literary analysis, though it can be extended to literature as well. Okay. Because I mean, you can't have literature without language at all, but it is primarily a language analysis of what happens in a text. Why is it called critical discourse analysis and not discourse analysis? Because there is something called discourse analysis in language studies before this came in. What did discourse analysis do? It looked at conversations and it tried to identify different features of a conversation. Okay. For example, a common framework that was discovered through discourse analysis is what is known as This is through discourse analysis, not critical discourse analysis. So, discourse analysis precedes critical discourse analysis, where the focus was mostly on conversations. Yeah. So, one of the frameworks of discourse analysis found out is that, for example, in many of the conversations, there is always an initiation, someone initiates, so I. To that initiation, there is a response, you have an R, and to that response, you have a feedback, so that is the F. So, initiation, response, feedback, etc. The feedback can then become an initiation, will initiate another response and a feedback. So, this is how conversations go on. So, this is one model, but remember it is not looking at any of these at all. So, domination, discrimination, power, control, they are not, it does not matter whether it is a man to woman or woman to woman speaking or a man to man speaking, they are not interested in that. This, they are looking at the features. Critical discourse analysis and therefore critical. So, this is where it becomes critical discourse analysis, also looks at these features. Okay. And as you can understand, since all of you have done critical theory, I am sure that you have done a bit of critical theory. So, it draws heavily from critical theory, critical discourse analysis. Okay. So, it is expanding the nature of language analysis now. It started in 1990s. I will just very quickly show you Norman Fairclough's model, but I have shared an article with Jan Blomiet, who gives you a very good overview of what has happened in critical discourse analysis till now. It is a 2015 article, so pretty recent. And that will give you an idea of what critical discourse analysis does. But I will give you one of the earliest founders of discourse, the critical CDA, it is called critical discourse analysis, is Fairclough, Norman Fairclough, and this is what his model was. And as you can see in this model, he divided them into 3 stages. He said we need to think of text, and for him a text is not simply a written piece, but it could be also a film, it could be a podcast, it could be a speech, anything. So, anything can be a text. So, he defined a text as an object of linguistic analysis, okay, because even films can be analyzed linguistically in a certain sense. The second part of that model is what he called discursive practices. So, what are the practices of discourse? Now, as you can imagine, the word actually comes from, and I am sure that you have done critical theory, from Michel Foucault. Yeah. So, this entire idea of discourse and discursive practices comes from Foucault. What do you do in understanding discursive practices? Fairclough says no language is simply in a vacuum. There are rules of production of language, distribution of language, and consumption of texts. Okay. For example, instead of simply asking the question, do you have Dickens in your world literature courses, Charles Dickens? No, but Wordsworth is there, right? Okay, good. So, we will take Wordsworth. So, instead of asking the question what Wordsworth says in Tintern Abbey or Prelude, but that is an important question to ask, okay, what does he say? But we also need to understand how was this text produced, for example. Okay. And you will be surprised to know that printing histories can give you very interesting insights into how a text was produced. Okay. Just to give you a very quick example, and that is why I started with Dickens. See, Charles Dickens is taken as one of these great English authors of the Victorian age, right? All of us have read at one point of time, people who have come from BA in English would know that we have all read Dickens's novels. Okay? You will be surprised to know that, maybe not so surprised because some of you might know it, that none of the Dickensian novels were actually published as novels. They were published as a part of periodicals. And that is why if you notice the chapters of Dickens's novels, it always ends as a cliffhanger, because if you leave it as a cliffhanger, then people will buy your magazine and to read the second part of it. Okay. You will also be surprised to know when he was writing Great Expectations, and also depended on, so if the audience mood changes, he used to receive a lot of letters from his readers. Depending on what they liked and what they did not like, he would change the plot as well. Okay. I will give you two examples of Dickens. He has a novel called The Old Curiosity Shop, okay, where there is this character called Little Nell. Okay. Dickens hated the character. She is a very nice goody girl who listens to everyone, does not challenge everyone, does not challenge anyone. She is the perfect woman in the Victorian times. Yeah? And Dickens hated her. So, one fine morning he decided he is going to kill her off, okay, in the next edition. He tells this to the publisher. The publisher is not a very ethical person, so he leaks it out. Dickens in the meantime has gone to America to give a talk. You know, he used to travel quite a lot to give talks. So, he comes down from the ship and he is walking along the harbor. Of course, he is quite a famous man. So, a lot of his readers were women. Dickens's novels were extremely popular with women. So, there are a lot of women standing over there waving at Dickens. Okay. And then as he is walking along, he suddenly realizes they are chanting something. So, he goes near them and they are chanting, "Please don't kill little Nell." And then he goes back and decides not to kill her because he is going to lose his readers. Yeah. Now, these are things that we kind of eliminate when we are reading a novel, but these have important implications for our understanding a novel. The second example I wanted to give you was Great Expectations. If you have read the novel, then you know that there are these two characters called Pip and Estella, who are supposed to fall in love but never do. And Dickens wanted to keep them separate till the end of the novel. They never meet. The publisher said, "You cannot do that, you need to have a happy ending." So, Dickens said, "I can't do a happy ending after writing so much, because I have almost made it clear that they are never going to get together. Okay, so, how am I going to make it a happy ending?" So, the publisher says, "You have to do something, otherwise you have to keep on continuing till they have a happy ending." So, Dickens says, "I can't do that, I am almost finished with that." And remember, he was also not in very good health when he was writing Great Expectations. So, at the end of Great Expectations, what he does is, and if you remember the end of the novel, Pip comes out of this house and he sees a carriage passing, okay? And Estella is sitting inside her, and Pip kind of nods and Estella waves and they leave. They do not meet, they do not get together, but at least there is a possibility of meeting. Okay? That is where he ends. Now, if I tell you, I am telling you it in the form of stories, but as you can realize that a text not only is determined by what the author writes, but also by the audience, by publishers, by print histories, etc., etc. So, all these have, so all this production has an important aspect in terms of what we read as text. How was it distributed? We do not look at distribution networks at all. For example, and this is very true of films, depending on who is the distributor of films. Okay? Many of these, what was for a very long time called parallel cinema, okay, which was not mainstream cinema, hardly found distributors because they said that, well, no one is going to pay money and watch them, they are just too boring. Okay? And it required a huge movement for parallel cinema films to be actually part of the mainstream movement, etc. Yeah? So, distribution does play an important role, and of course, how the text consumed. So, all these play an important role in understanding any kind of a text, and that is what critical discourse analysis looks at. And of course, the social practices that operate at a certain point of time. Okay? I will give you an example of this. So, the different kind of power relations, we talked about ideologies in the morning, the hegemonic struggles that discourse reproduce, challenge or restructure. So, every discourse always produces a certain kind of a struggle, either in forms of agreeing or disagreeing or providing resistance, etc. Okay. I'll just give you an example from a late writer of 19th century, and I am sure that I do not know whether he is there in your world literature course. So, he has this famous novel called The Picture of Dorian Gray and a famous play called The Importance of Being Earnest. Okay. After he writes Importance of Being Earnest, I will tell you the story. It is actually playing in London theatres, and it is suddenly revealed, there is a long story behind that, but let me not get into that, that Wilde has been arrested. Okay. Why? Because of gross misconduct and indecency. That is the exact term that is used, gross misconduct and indecency, which literally translates into homosexuality in the Victorian age. It is also revealed that this is not the first time that he is implicated in this. He is released, he stays in London for some time, goes to France and dies within he dies young, remember he dies at the age of 46. Yeah. Now, he is tried under a law which was promulgated in 1885 in Britain, which banned these kind of relationships. Wilde is almost, though his Importance of Being Earnest is quite a popular play, his novels sell very well, he is almost put in the dustbins of history, especially by modernist writers, not because he was a bad writer, but because of a certain kind of gross misconduct and indecency. In fact, T.S. Eliot, one of the major modernist poets, says there is a hallucination of meaning in people like them. They can't think straight and therefore they hallucinate. Yeah? W.B. Yeats condemned this entire generation, which he calls the fin de siècle. I don't know how to pronounce it. You know, the end of an era. That generation as what he calls a tragic generation. Okay, that this is a tragic generation. It is later revealed, of course, that many of these people who belonged to this so-called aesthetic movement had different kinds of sexual orientations. Now, these facts come into light much after the text is produced, but also has an effect on how the text is perceived for a very long time. Of course, they are revived in the 1980s and 90s. Now, the aesthetic movement, which I do not know if you have done a history of English literature in your BA days, you would know that the aesthetic movement is kind of just mentioned and then you move on. Okay, you do not really study anything over there. It is still considered to be too difficult to handle. But of course, a lot of scholarship has started happening in the aesthetic movement, and that they have shown now aesthetic movement had a major role to play in what we call modernism in English literature. Okay, they were the pioneers in that sense. So, these kind of relational ideologies is something that we also need to look at. This is what critical discourse analysis does. I think I will just come to the last one and then we can have a discussion. This is something that I thought I will just mention. This is something called teacher research. Till now, the research has always been on students. How do students learn? But the question is, how do teachers teach? And what are the problems that teachers face? How do they address those problems? Okay. Till now, we did not have a framework for doing research on that. With teacher research, which is very recent, it started around 2012-13, really picked up pace after 2015. With teacher research, this was initially known as something called action research. Action research is basically you identify a problem that you face. For example, if I am teaching in a classroom and I see that there are in class after class after class, there are some students who do not seem to comprehend what I am saying. So, there is a problem in the class. So, I address that problem in a certain way. I take action on it, I study that action and then write about it. So, that was called action research. Okay. But teacher research is a bit more, so action research is much more structured. Teacher research is much more reflective. So, it is simply you encounter problems. So, it is research initiated by teachers on issues of their own importance. So, you decide what is important to you. You gather data, you analyze it and share it. So, it is not simply that you are writing a paper on this. Yeah. So, what you do is you try to identify the problem, you gather data on the problem, maybe talk to the students who fail to understand, why are they failing to understand, etc. And it is not that you are going to present it in a conference, that is why we generally gather data. The idea of teacher research is that you share it with your colleagues, okay, so that it helps others. So, it forms communities of practice, that is what they are called. So, you produce a community of practice, where you learn from each other, from the problems that you face in the class, etc. And of course, it is research by teachers for teachers. It is not meant for big academic this thing. And if you are really interested in what teacher research is, I have shared this, so you can just click on the link, and there is a lovely YouTube video by Richard Smith, who is one of the proponents of teacher research, who talks about how teacher research can be done. Okay. But I hope you have been able to get the major idea of how it is done. So, you identify a problem, you gather data on the problem, analyze the problem, share it with other teachers, get their feedback, etc. Yeah. So, just summing up, corpus linguistics, what does it help us do? It helps us locate real world data. It is not some constructed data that you are using in the classroom. It helps promote learner autonomy. So, I can tell my students to go to corpus and solve their problems, and you can do a lexical and grammatical analysis through corpus. Multimodal analysis, understanding and modifying the nature of text. So, text is not simply a written or a spoken text, texts are multimodal in nature. So, we need to understand that, and of course, initiating students into real life practices. So, it is not simply that I am using a textbook in the class, but I can now ask students to look at texts that are there around, they are constantly surrounded by, and then take up research projects based on those other texts that they are encountering in their daily lives. Critical discourse analysis, language as we understood is implicated in power relations, and linguistic practices are seen as networks. So, it is not simply that Dickens has written a book and we are going to just look at the book and nothing else. So, how was the book produced, how was the book disseminated, how was the book received, etc., are all a part of this network, and we need to understand those networks as well. And teacher research, of course, is self-reflection and modifying one's own practices. Okay. I will stop here, but I am sure that you will have questions, and that is my email ID. So, please feel free to write to me. I think we could.
Thank you very much, sir. My question is that what could be the possible limitations of the standard tests that we have, like TOEFL and others, in evaluating the communicative competency of learners?
So, that was the only question?
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, we were talking about something, I think with her in the morning on this question of IELTS and TOEFL, etc. Let me tell you the procedure first. How are IELTS tests created and how are TOEFL tests created? They are all internet-based tests now. They are called IBTs. Now, so what they do is they create a data bank of test items, because IELTS tests all the 4 skills. So you have listening, you have speaking, you have reading, you have writing, yeah? And they're tested separately. Writing in some cases is still human evaluated, mostly human evaluated, but they are also planning to get it computer evaluated. I don't know how far is that possible today, but they might do it in the future. Okay, but right now, if you have ever given IELTS, then you know that you have to write, if you are doing academic module, then you have to write something as a response and then an essay. So there are 2 tasks in the writing part of IELTS. So the first task is a response to a graph or a picture or whatever, and the second part is an essay that you have to write in about 250 words. If you are doing the other module, which I don't know what it is called, don't remember now. So in the other module, it's primarily for migration purposes. It's not for academic purposes. I think it's called the general module. The general module. So, for example, if you want to migrate to Canada or the US, then you take the general module, and if you have certain soft skills. So there also the writing task is similar. So you respond, but the level of difficulty is lower. Okay. And the essay that you will have in the general module is more of a personal nature. For example, your favorite hobby, or so it's, and the academic module will have an essay of an academic nature. So it will ask for your opinions about a particular topic, etc. Yeah? So this is how IELTS operates. How are the tests created? The tests are created by collecting a huge amount of testing items. Testing items are primarily what you call questions. Okay. For listening, it is multiple choice. In reading, it is multiple choice. In speaking, of course, you are human tested, and in writing, you have to write. Okay. So for listening and speaking, they collect huge amount of test items from a wide variety of experts. Okay. The second stage is all these items are piloted. Now, piloting is a research process. Anyone who is using a questionnaire for their research? No one? You are using a questionnaire?
No, I'm not using it. I've used
You have used a questionnaire. So one of the processes of using, you know what a questionnaire is, right? You shared that questionnaire with a large number of people. You collect their opinions on it. But one of the processes of using a questionnaire is that once you prepare a questionnaire, you have to pilot it. What is piloting? So let's say I'm going to give a questionnaire to 30 people on the campus. But before that, I use the questionnaire with 10 people. Okay. I get the data back from it. I analyze the data. There are now ways of doing it on computers, and then I can find out how reliable the questionnaire is. If it is throwing up too many different answers for the same questions, then it is not reliable. So a questionnaire has to be reliable and valid. So it can be repeated again and again. Yeah? Anyway, so let's not get into that. So these test items are piloted. Okay? The scores are generated and then they are analyzed. Then they are sent for monitoring. Then they are repiloted. Then they are remodified, and then they are given for testing. So it's a very long and expensive process. Therefore, IELTS tests, I don't know how much do they cost now, but it must be around 12,000, 13,000, 18,000? 18? Oh, that's in Bangladesh. Okay, all right. So it's becoming even more expensive. So I must be dated. So yeah. Okay. So if it is, so it's a very expensive test to take. But remember, it's also a high stakes test. Um, can you give those tests to judge language all IELTS and TOEFL tests are based on what I call the CFR levels, okay? Because these are high stakes tests, because it will determine whether you will get admission in a university or not. So you might have been offered a PhD program at whatever, Harvard or MIT or wherever, and one of the specifications that they give is this much should be a TOEFL score, or you should have a 7.5 at least in IELTS. Now if you don't get 7.5, remember, you have already invested quite a lot of money. You're going to lose it. So it's a very high stakes test. And therefore the tests are pretty reliable in that sense. Can they be used for judging language proficiency? They are meant for judging language proficiency. It's based on the CFR level. So for example, I said there are these two modules, general module and the academic module. The general module is meant for migrants, so you don't need very high levels of English, but communicative English. So there they will ask for, let's say, B1 maximum. For academic, they will ask for a C1 or a C2. So C1, C2 is around 7 to 9 in IELTS, etc. So if you know IELTS, there are these bands. Sorry? Not 5. 5 is intermediate. It is B1, B2. Yeah, 7.5 to 9. Yeah. So anything between 7 to 9 is the advanced level. In IELTS, there are 9 bands from 1 to 9. You don't have a 0 in IELTS because you will know some language. It's impossible to get a 0. So it's 1 to 9. So the beginner's level is, let's say, 1 to 3. The intermediate level is 4 to 6. And the advanced level is 7 to 9. Yeah. But if you're, depending on the university that you're going to, the band requirements might vary. If it's I don't know, Harvard or MIT, they might ask for a band 8. I don't know. Yeah. So I hope that answered the question, right? So they can be used as very, very reliable tests to judge language proficiency. They're pretty reliable. You'll have to come again. You don't have an option. This is one of the. We don't have a hand mic. I think hand mic would have solved the problem.
Like we just discussed about this action research. So what could be the possible ways of integrating ELT practices to enhance learners' English proficiency using this action research?
See, action research or teacher research, as we know them, is primarily meant for teacher proficiency, not so much of student proficiency, but it can also help student proficiency. For example, if I'm trying to solve a problem of students not learning certain things in the class, then I'm also helping students in a certain way. Okay. Can they be used for enhancing language teaching? I mean, any research finally does enhance whatever you are researching on, right? Whatever the field that you are in. So yes, of course, I mean, so if you're doing research on teacher practice or students' learning of language or teachers' own difficulties in making the students learn a language, they always will, the research will help you, and because it helps you, it kind of disseminates to the students as well.
Are there any specific methods devised
For action research, for teacher research, you mean?
to integrate this?
I mean, you can always integrate, they are generally integrated in teacher education programs. Okay. So you have these massive teacher education programs that are conducted, so they're generally integrated over there. But you can also integrate it within the classroom. So in some higher classrooms, some teachers, so that's why I said that you could go to Richard Smith's YouTube video where he talks about it. So some teachers, what they have done also is, for example, in standards 11 and 12, where students have a reasonable amount of language, they also ask students to take up action research, to do a short project on a difficulty that they face, collect data on it, and the way that they have tried to solve it or trying to solve it, or whether the teacher has helped them to solve it, and then write something on a school magazine or put it up on the school walls, etc. So even that could be integrated within teaching itself. So remember in standard 11, 12 or even 9, 10, I think in some schools, they have these projects. Students will have to complete projects. So one of the projects could be this, a learning difficulty that you have, and then you do a bit of a research on that. Actually, everyone is taking photos. How are you going to share them? Actually, you have, they have your number. They have your numbers. So they will share.
They all. Take close-up photos.
You can read. I think that's that.
Yes, they are asking so.
Good afternoon, respected Professor Atanu Bhattacharya, esteemed faculty members, and dear students. It's a great honor to extend our sincere vote of thanks on behalf of Nalanda University for the insightful and intellectually enriching series of lectures developed by Professor Atanu Bhattacharya over the past 4 days. We are truly grateful for your time and the depth of thought you brought into each session. On the first day, your lecture began with a comprehensive overview of the history of English language teaching across the world, South Asia, and particularly the Indian subcontinent. Furthermore, your discussion on pioneering educational institutions such as the Asiatic Society and Fort William College illuminated their significant contributions in institutionalizing English language education in the region. On the second day, your detailed exposition of different methods, approaches, and principles of English language teaching enriched our academic horizon. Especially, your discussion on the Bangalore project and task-based language teaching developed by Professor Prof was truly inspiring. On the third day, your insights into the role of technology in English language education encouraged us to embrace digital tools in learning language. On the fourth day, we gained invaluable knowledge about the different phases of textbook development and the success of story of the low resource material classrooms. Today, in your concluding lecture, your reflection on the emerging possibilities of research in language teaching, particularly linguistic exploration, socio-historical orientation, and ethnographic social semiotic frameworks, has expanded our perspective on how language learning and teaching are deeply rooted in cultural, social, and historical context. Your emphasis on the action research and pedagogic implications have inspired us to critically connect theory with practice in our own teaching environments. We'd also like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Professor Sushant Sir, our Dean, whose continued support and vision made this entire academic engagement possible. Thank you again, Professor Bhattacharya, for inspiring and enlightening us with your presence.
Thank you. Thank
So-
you for the wonderful.
So of course, you can see that the students have immensely benefited. Thank you for having taken time. I know you have a very, very busy schedule, but we are grateful that we have taken time. And hopefully in future, we will have these specializations also coming up, because this is where you get the whole issue of digital humanities also emerges from here. So that emergence we need to understand, and gradually we will work more and more on it. So in future, we would request for your support in this.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.